Hey folks, Jack from Moonshift Audio here. After my recent video on different types of compressor, I got a couple of messages and comments asking about a more basic video on compression, and in particular how to hear what's going on with compression. To my mind, compression is definitely the hardest tool to master when it comes to audio processing, and part of the problem I think is that compressors often do much more than just compress. A lot of the sound and character that many compressors impart on the material you put through them is actually less to do with the gain reduction that's taking place, and more to do with the saturation, subtle changes in tonal balance that they add to the signal along the way. For example, when I reach for an LA2A, a huge part of what I'm getting from that compressor is the beautiful brightness and clarity that can add to, say, a vocal. Or when I slam a bass through an 1176, I'm doing that as much for the gritty saturation that it adds as the actual gain reduction. Reading your comments and messages on my last compression video, it made total sense to me that all of this stuff can make it really confusing if you're just trying to learn what a basic compressor does. So I've made this video where I use a simple digital compressor on a few common sources to demonstrate the fundamentals of gain reduction and dynamic tone shaping that you can get from a compressor. Let's take a look. Okay, so here we are in Cubase, and I've got a very simple loop that I've built here out of a section of the vocal from my previous video where I recreated To Be Honest by Christine and the Queens. I've also got a bass part that I played in deliberately sloppily and a kick and snare that I programmed. So the loop sounds like this. You should hear some real inconsistencies in the volume, particularly on the vocal and on the bass. Now, when you've got these kind of inconsistencies in the level, in this case it's between different words on the vocal and different sort of pick strokes on the bass, you're absolutely going to want to reach for a compressor, and you're going to want to use a compressor for its main kind of purpose, which is to level out the volume of things, to control inconsistencies in the volume of different sources. So we'll start off by looking at this vocal. Now if I zoom in here, you can see quite clearly that there are some louder words, like this word here, at the start and end of the first phrase, some quieter sections such as here, and again here we've got the sort of louder word at the start and end of this phrase. Particularly you'll hear it here. I've noticed there's a noticeable jump in volume between the start of this second phrase and the middle, and then again at the end. Broken and yet tender, always in and always out. Can you hear how the first always is much louder than the in and always, and then the out is also quite loud? Always in and always out. Now these kind of changes in level are absolutely normal for even a well-recorded vocal, and that's why it's almost unheard of, with a couple of notable exceptions, not to compress a vocal. So for this tutorial, I'm going to use the Waves C1 compressor. Now, the reason I've gone for this one is because it's a digital compressor, it's pretty much characterless, it doesn't add much in the way of saturation or tonal changes, and it's got a very simple set of controls. If you don't know the basics about what threshold, ratio, attack, release, and makeup gain do on a compressor, this probably isn't the right video for you, so I'd recommend coming back another time. But this is a nice simple compressor to look at. I did think about using the TDR Katalnikov for this video because it's a great free option, but the two-stage release on that compressor makes it a little bit more complicated than I wanted, so I'm sticking with this one. I'm going to set the ratio to 4:1, which is a nice starting point for any kind of sort of basic level reduction. I'm going to pull the attack as quick as it will go. We'll leave the release on 50 there. And let's see what we get when we start to pull down the threshold. Broken and yet tender, always in and always out. Broken and yet tender. Now, one of the first things you hear is that it's getting quieter, and the reason that is because when the incoming signal hits the threshold, the compressor kicks in and it applies gain reduction, which is what compression is all about. So the louder sections are getting made quieter, which is why most compressors have a makeup gain option, because you don't want to make your signal quieter, you're trying to make it more consistent. So I'm going to put some of this gain back in, and I'm going to bypass the compressor just to make sure it's about the same level. Broken and yet tender, always in and always out. Broken and yet tender. Okay, so I'm fairly happy now that this compressor isn't adding or removing any overall volume. It's just leveling things out. So let's just take a listen, and I'm going to focus on this second phrase. So this is without the compressor. Got those inconsistencies in level. And now I'll activate the compressor. Now, I would certainly say that the overall level there is much more consistent, and that will sit in a mix much better. But I am hearing, and this is where you kind of got to train your ears, like I can hear a certain kind of lifelessness, a certain sort of flatness, if you like, particularly at the start of the phrase. Let's just listen to this without the compressor. Now with. So just to bring a bit more kind of life and a bit of natural kind of breath back into this, as in to let the source material breathe rather than the actual breath sound of the vocal, I'm just going to increase the attack. And maybe pull down the threshold as we're getting less gain reduction now with that attack a bit slower. So I'm pretty happy with that now as a sort of utilitarian volume leveled compressed signal. So what I'm going to do is, so that we can compare the two waveforms, I'm going to bounce out this audio. Okay, so here we are. This is the compressed vocal, and you can see just by looking that those levels are much more consistent. We haven't got these kind of big peaks and quieter sections. Everything is a lot more consistent. And if we play it back, broken and yet tender, always in and always out. And this is the uncompressed version. Broken and yet tender, always in and always out. Broken and yet tender, much more solid, always in and always out. Much more powerful, much easier to sit in a mix. Okay, so what would happen if we were to really overcompress this vocal? I'm going to pull up the compressor again, and I'm going to pull the ratio up much higher to 10:1. And I'm going to pull the attack to 0, or as close as we can get to 0. We can take a listen to that. Obviously, we're getting loads of compression now. Just going to pull the gain up, compensate for that. Broken and yet tender, always in and always out. Broken and yet tender, always in and always out. So you start to hear it's almost like a kind of distortion. The breath sounds, the quietest parts of that vocal are coming right up as the louder sections are squashed down to meet them. And the whole thing starts to sound sort of a little bit kind of lifeless and unnatural. Let's see what happens if I export that. Okay, so now we're sort of getting that sort of sausage. If I just pull the gain up on that, you can see that there really isn't much in the way of life left of that, particularly in this second phrase. Look at that, just almost like a flat line. Broken and yet tender, always in and always out. So with this compressed version, we've got a nice balance between squashing some of the peaks, taming some of the inconsistencies there, but still giving the vocal a little bit of room to breathe. With this ridiculously compressed version, it really is just completely overdone. Broken and yet tender. You can almost hear the vocal pumping as well. In the middle of this phrase here, broken and yet tender, the compressor's just working way too hard. Okay, let's take a look at the bass now. caveat, the best thing to do with a bass that's recorded like this is to record it again. If I was in a session and I had any kind of control, or if I was recording this myself, I would not be happy with a take like that. These pick strokes are all over the place, and the best possible thing you could do would be to just go back and do it again. But I've deliberately made this bad to emphasize the issues that you can use a compressor to address, and because we don't always have the luxury of being able to tell the bass player to go back and do it again or re-record it ourselves. Sometimes you just got what you got. But if I loop this section where it's just playing one note, pretty clear that those levels are all over the place, and that's never going to work as the backbone of a mix. So we're going to compress it. So I'll pull up the C1 again. We'll go 4:1 ratio. I'll pull the attack way down, and we can start to lower the threshold. Put some makeup gain back in. Now you may be able to hear there a bit of distortion. And this is a really important thing to learn about digital compressors. When you pull the attack and the release sometimes, particularly if you have them both incredibly short, you can get this kind of distortion. And you might think, oh, I'm overcompressing, it's that kind of distortion, but it's not. What happens on some kind of material with a very short attack or release time on a digital compressor is the compressor kind of flips back and forth between active and not active. The detection circuit is coming on and off really quickly, and you hear this kind of, it sounds like digital distortion. You can hear this sort of slightly raspy kind of distortion on that. Whereas if I just open the attack up ever so slightly, cleans it up. So that's a really useful tip. Now that we've got the attack set so it's not problematic, but it's still very quick, you can see that gain reduction meter jumping around directly relevant to the level of the incoming notes. And if I bypass it, and now back on, so we're absolutely leveling out that bass, and that will sit in the mix much better now. I can export this as well so we can take a look at what we're doing to the wave, and there it is, a nice much more consistent waveform. Compared to the original uncompressed bass, where you can see and hear those quite big differences in volume from the different pick strokes. So I'm going to turn that compressor on again, and we can hear this is the compressed vocal and the compressed bass with those drums. Broken and you're tender. Just going to pull the level back a little bit. Always in and always out. Broken and you're tender. Always in and always out. So we've actually got quite a nice solid bass that really works there. You could almost start to build a track around that. Whereas the uncompressed vocal and the uncompressed bass, broken and you're tender. Always in and always out. Broken and you're tender. You can just hear it lacks that solidity, that consistency that you need to build a track around. So in some ways, getting the compression, getting your dynamics sorted is a fundamental to getting a solid, consistent, punchy mix. Speaking about getting a punchy mix, I want to take a quick look at the second way that we can use compression. So far I've just focused on sort of smoothing out and evening out volumes in different source material. We've flattened out those inconsistencies in the vocal and here in the bass. But you can also use compression as a tone shaping device. And I'm not talking about character compressors, because almost all of the time that character is coming from different stages in the compression circuit, tubes or transformers or other things that are basically applying saturation. Sometimes it's about the way that the compression is physically triggered, and that's why you've got so many different types of compressor, all with their different flavors. And I look into that in some detail in my compressor types video from the other week. But you can shape the tone of a sound with a very transparent compressor, and I'm just going to show you a little bit about how you might do that by coming back to this bass. And the way that we're going to do that is with the attack. Just going to compress this a bit harder. Now you can hear the compressor working a bit. There's a little bit of a sort of at the start of each note, which is telling me that this is overcompressed. But the level's very consistent. But what I'm now going to do is I'm going to increase the attack, and we should hear the twang, the initial very first transient part of each pick-on string, which is the sort of, you call it the attack portion of each sound, start to come through, because the compressor's attack is slow enough so that that will come through before the compressor is activated. So we hear the transient come through, and then the compressor clamps down on the signal after that. So this is uncompressed. So you should start to hear a bit of the sort of twang coming through there. If I activate the compressor now, if I increase the attack further, we might hear that even more. And I'll turn it off again. So that is a way that you can use a compressor. In this case, it's making it a bit more aggressive. You're kind of bringing out the attack. The bass becomes a bit more spiky and lively, but it's not inconsistent in level like it used to be. So at the same time as leveling out the different strengths of those pick strokes, you're also really tone shaping. You're bringing out the attack portion of that sound. And you can do that on a rap vocal, and you can do that on drums, which is what I'm going to look at next. So we'll take a look at the kick. Now this is a live sample, but this is a programmed kick. So we don't really have any inconsistencies in volume to worry about. This isn't a live recording. We don't have human error. Got some slightly softer notes, but that's deliberate. So why would we want to compress? And the answer to that is, much like we did with the bass just now, tone shaping. So I've got the compressor here. I'm going to put it on 4:1 again. Put the attack as quick as we go, and I'm going to start to pull down the threshold. You can hear the compressor working. I'm going to put some makeup gain in. So the first thing that we hear there is that the compressor is squashing the loudest part of the sound, which is the attack portion, that very, very initial transient part of the sound. And then we're putting the level back in overall, and what we're hearing there is it's bringing up the quieter section. So in this case, the tail of the kick. So the sound becomes much longer, much fuller. we do lose a little bit of the sort of punch that kick had, that initial kind of beater on skin transient. And we can get that back and even emphasize it by increasing the attack. So if we bring the attack up, the compressor won't act immediately. It's going to wait for as long as we ask it to, from detecting that initial transient to actually starting to clamp down on the gain reduction. So I'm going to pull this up now. Now, a neat way of really getting to the meat of this quite quickly is to sort of massively overcook it. So I'm going to put the ratio right up, going to pull the threshold right down. We'll have the attack very, very quick again, and we should hear this is just going to be massively overcompressed. A bit more makeup gain in. If we now start to creep up the attack, we can really hear the smack of that coming through. And if we now put the ratio back to a slightly more normal level and raise the threshold and lower the makeup gain, so this is uncompressed and now compressed. So you can hear that drums become much more punchy, much more aggressive, and actually quite lively. Just to give you an idea of what might happen if you were to push the compressor too far. Start to hear some weird kind of resonances coming out there. Sounds quite unnatural. And we've really lost the natural character of that drum. There are a lot of cases where really, really heavy compression is desirable, and you can certainly play around yourself, absolutely slamming things. But if you're trying to learn the ropes when it comes to compression, it's a good idea to try and sort of bear in mind while you're tweaking what the character of the sound was coming in, and if there are any parts of that that you want to preserve or accentuate, try and keep that in mind whilst you're adjusting the controls. Okay folks, thanks for watching. If you found this video useful, please do like and subscribe for more tips, tricks, resources and downloads from me at Moonshift Audio. Till next time.